When it comes to tasting whiskey, there's a great deal of misinformation out there, and it should be no surprise because flavour as a subject is quite complex and particularly fuzzy to understand. There's a great deal we don't know about flavour. However, once we start looking at the science that we do know and the science of tasting whiskey, it becomes clear that there are certain things we are doing that may actually be impeding or hampering your experience of tasting whiskey. And this is what we're going to look at today. My name's Kami from The Sensory Advantage, and join me as we take a deep dive into the science of tasting whiskey. So, what do I mean by there are three things that could be impeding your experience of whiskey? Well, firstly, there are certain assumptions that people make about flavour and certain methods that people use based on those assumptions. And these assumptions are not necessarily aligned with what the science has to say about what happens when we nose and taste whiskey. So let's take a look. What's the first one we're going to talk about? It's specifically to do with nosing and sticking one's honker or schnozzle, to use the technical term, into the glass. What do I mean? Well, just because the glass has a nice opening to it doesn't mean to say that it's compulsory to stick body parts into that opening. So the common approach, which makes perfect sense, is to stick one's nose into the glass because, hey, that's where the flavour happens, isn't it? But actually, especially with whiskey and cask strength whiskey, what we're getting when we do this is a lot of alcohol. And alcohol is an irritant. It'll cause these burning sensations. And it will also mask a lot of other aromas in the glass. What do I mean by masking? Well, because the alcohol is so powerful, it actually overpowers some of the other molecules. So you're literally not smelling them because all you're smelling is the alcohol. Now, people talk about the dip in, dip out method, where you have a wee sniff and then come away again. It makes sense, I understand that. However, if we just adjust where we actually smell on the glass, we can completely change our experience. So rather than sticking your nose into the glass, have a go perching your nose on the top of the glass, just at the upper rim. And when we sniff from here, we actually get much less alcohol. You get much less of that burn than when you stick your nose in the glass, but you still get all the aroma and all the odour and all the subtleties just by changing where you sniff. And of course you can switch between the two. You can go nose in the glass, nose above the glass. You could even try nose under the glass, although that's not quite as good. So this is my first tip. Stop sticking your nose in the glass habitually. Try perching your nose on top of the glass. Give it a try, see how you get on. The second one is close your mouth. What do I mean? Well, it's common for people to say when you nose whiskey, when you smell the whiskey, you should keep your mouth open to help to ventilate air around the nasal cavity. Now, to understand why this doesn't make sense and why it's not actually helping you, we need to look a little bit at how we smell. So over here, a little bit of an alien head, but never mind. Up here in the mouth, we have the palate. This is what separates the mouth, the oral cavity, from the nasal cavity, the nose. When you push your tongue against the roof of your mouth, this is what you can feel. And then the nasal cavity is here, tongue is in here, and then we have the throat coming down this way. So at the top of the nasal cavity, we have our odour receptors, which are connected to the olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb is connected to the brain. Now, when we take a sniff from a glass, there's our glass, odour molecules, called volatile molecules, travel from the glass up the nose and interact with our olfactory receptors, these odour receptors at the top of the nasal cavity. Now, to do so, to allow this to happen, we have to close off the oral cavity where the mouth is. Try breathing through your nose with your mouth open, but don't do anything with your tongue. Push the tongue down into the bottom of the mouth and see if you can breathe in through your nose. It's impossible. The air comes in through the mouth. If the air comes in through the mouth, it's not going to go into the nasal cavity where it can be detected as odours. What we have to do to have the mouth open and still breathe through the nose is close the back of the throat using the back of the tongue. So if you keep your mouth open, breathe through your nose, naturally you'll use the back of the tongue to close this oral cavity here. So the tongue moves up at the back here to close off this oral cavity so no air can go through, so then the air is forced through the nose. Now obviously if you do this, it's no different to just closing your lips and keeping your mouth closed. When we're nosing whiskey, it's all about these odour molecules hitting the receptors at the top of the nasal cavity. That's all that's happening. We're not worried about anything that's happening in the mouth, because in the mouth we have our taste receptors and our mouthfeel receptors, which are not going to be activated by odours. When we smell, when we nose, it's all about odours. The odours are travelling up here and then down into the lungs. We want to enhance this as much as possible, and the best way to enhance it is get an efficient airflow in through the nose and down through the throat. And the best way to do this is to close the mouth. And then you can really focus on the odours, because when we sniff, when we nose, that's what we're interested in. What's the third one, you may ask? Third one is stop looking at tasting notes, at least before you taste. Now don't get me wrong, things like flavour wheels, tasting notes, they can be handy, especially when you're at an earlier stage in your whiskey journey, to point you in the right direction, to understand what types of flavours you should be looking for in whiskies. But something very interesting happens when we start to look at the words that we associate with flavours. So for example, when we think about a flavour, if we say orange, immediately in our head we can picture an orange, we can feel its waxy texture, we can taste its slightly sharp but also sweet character, we can smell it. So we have a very strong image in our heads of orange. We can, if we think of say lemon, and biting into a lemon, we can feel that puckering sensation in the corners of the mouth already from the tartness of the lemon, the sourness, without actually even having a lemon with us. So the brain is very powerful at giving us these sensations just from the memory or the thought of something. Now, when we nose and taste a whiskey, it's pure perception. The experience of this is created in the brain. So the molecules travel into the nose, and then when we take a sip, the molecules are interacting with our receptors in the mouth and receptors in the nose, and this becomes flavour. And the brain combines all of this together, but creates perception from it. So without the brain, none of this would happen. So essentially, flavour happens in the brain, not in the glass, because it's the brain that's creating this perception. But what can happen is, sometimes when we smell a whiskey, and we can smell, say, chocolate, now there's obviously no actual chocolate in this glass. What's happening is the brain is smelling odour molecules that reminds it of when it smelt chocolate. It matches the two experiences together and says, I've smelt those types of molecules before, that reminds me of chocolate, but obviously there's no chocolate in here. Now this is great. These are called odour objects, where the brain has an object that it associates with a group of odour molecules and stores them together, chocolate being a good example. Now what can happen when we think about the word associated with an aroma is verbal overshadowing. What is verbal overshadowing, I hear you say? Verbal overshadowing is when we think of the word that's associated with an odour. So let's say, for example, banana. Now, the brain then brings up the odour memory of banana, and we can smell banana, we can see banana, we have a visual image of banana in our head, we can feel its textures. And that memory that's associated with the word can be more powerful than the actual physical experience of what we're smelling. So if I'm smelling this whiskey, regardless of whether it actually really smells of banana or not, if then I read a tasting note that says banana, and we start thinking of banana, the brain can prioritize the thought of banana over the physical experience of smelling. So then the thought of banana becomes more powerful than the actual odor molecules in this glass. So in essence, we could smell banana when really it's not as banana-y as we think. Now obviously there are limitations. If I have a lovely Speyside non-peated whiskey and I'm reading a tasting note that says ship's tar and charcoal, it's not going to magically put that impression in my head. It has to be something along similar lines. But when we smell, things are particularly fuzzy. What do I mean by this? Well, because the brain is taking lots of different odor molecules, bunching them together and trying to create perception from it, it means there's a lot of room for personal opinion and subjectivity. So we can often have our own experience of this, but it's a very complex and fuzzy experience that isn't necessarily going to align with the person next to us. It's very subjective and it's difficult to pin down because we can't see odors, we can't touch them. All we can do is smell them. And then we only become aware of them when the brain creates perception and says, I can smell these things. So in essence, when we read a tasting note and it's saying things like almonds, banana, black cherries, the brain can prioritize those words over what we're actually smelling. So then we start to believe that we're smelling those things rather than actually just having the experience of what's happening. So by all means, use tasting notes, but try your whiskey first, taste it first, experience it, come to your own conclusions without being misled, because remember, tasting notes is somebody else's opinion. And because flavour is so subjective, everybody will have a different opinion of what it tastes like. We have different genes, we have different thresholds for different types of molecules, and therefore what may smell very sulphury to one person is actually very not sulphury to another person. So it's very, very subjective. So use tasting notes, try the whiskey first, taste it, come to your own conclusions, then refer to the tasting note afterwards to see if you're aligned with that. You may or may not, and it's absolutely fine, don't worry about it. But just be aware of this concept called verbal overshadowing, whereby the thought of an aroma, the word that we associate with aromas, can overshadow the actual physical experience. If you enjoyed this and found it interesting, please like, subscribe or share. It's all about passing on this knowledge to create ripple effects that help all of us to gain a better experience when we're tasting whiskey and to get more from the glass. If you're interested in learning more, please visit our website at thesensoryadvantage.com, where you can view our online courses. We also offer on-site courses for industry professionals. Please take a look and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.